Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to video chat number 5. In today's video, I'm going to go over some announcements about things I've posted on Blackboard, and I want to introduce you to our next reading, Jack Metzgar's book, Striking Steel, which is one of my favorite books, and I think you're going to like it too. First, let's talk about what I've posted on Blackboard for you. So you'll notice that I shared an announcement with you in an email that I have all of your remaining weekly assignment due dates on a document. Take a look at that. Those include the 3 Metzgar chapters that you each will be reading, plus 3 additional assignments. One is your blog source list. Remember, you need 5 sources. 3 primary and 2 secondary. And yes, you can have more. The other things are, you'll notice that I have posted some videos, 2 videos on Blackboard resources page. One is called City Rising, on the informal economy in Los Angeles, and it follows the story of 4 different workers, each of whom is struggling to make ends meet, and each of whom is engaged in a different kind of worker organizing. Sometimes it's community organizing, sometimes it's through a labor union, but these are different forms of worker organizing. So take a look at that video, and also a video documentary called Class Dismissed, How TV Frames the Working Class. So this looks at how television portrays the working class in the United States, or how it ignores the working class oftentimes. This video is particularly relevant to our discussion of Metzgar. One of Metzgar's questions is, how is it that working class struggles have largely been forgotten in the history books and popular culture? And so that question is also dealt with in this movie. And so one of the assignments you have is to watch one of these movies and write a summary. And for the final assignment, you can either choose the other movie to write a summary of, or pick one of the articles that on coronavirus and its impact on workers, which is really having quite an extraordinary impact. There's a wave of strikes going on as workers are protesting for better working conditions, for medical sick leave, for higher pay, and for things like protective equipment at work. So these struggles are happening right now, and it's labor history happening right as we speak. So you can also choose one of those articles to write a summary on. Okay, so let's look at Metzgar's book. All right, I want you to read his introduction, and let me give you a brief overview of his introduction. The introduction starts out basically with a discussion of an argument that he has with his father, Johnny Metzgar, who was a steel worker in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And this argument takes place after Johnny Metzgar has retired, and he is becoming more conservative as he gets older. And he starts complaining in one visit with his son about how the mine workers are going on strike and they're getting welfare benefits while they're on strike. And Johnny Metzgar thinks that this is unfair. Johnny Metzgar represents the kind of working class conservatism that went for Reagan in the 1980s. And these working class whites were often called Reagan Democrats because they had voted Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt. But with Reagan, they started to shift toward more conservatism. And if you think about the complaint about welfare, it's often racially coded. In fact, Reagan, in his campaign speeches in the 1980s, would often tell an apocryphal story that is one we don't know whether it was true or not, but he would tell this story on the campaign trail about how how you were standing in line at the grocery store and some young buck, and he would always use the phrase young buck. Well, young buck is kind of a slang term for an African American man. And he would always say, this young buck is in front of you in line, and he's buying a big steak, and he's using food stamps, and he's using your hard-earned tax dollars to buy food that you can't afford. And if you think about this, what it is it's targeting white working class voters with racial resentment. And it's breaking that class solidarity between black and white and pitting one against the other and saying he's taking from you. Okay, and so this was a very active strategy by Ronald Reagan. In fact, it was called the Southern strategy because it was designed to appeal to Southern whites, but it also appealed to a lot of Northern blue-collar whites. Okay, so Jack, the historian, is in this argument with his working-class father, and on page 3, he tells the story of this argument, and he says he exploded at his dad, and he says, shame on you. I don't know whether the miners have a legitimate beef or not, but they think they're fighting to preserve their union. Where would we be today without the mine workers? Where would your life have been without the miners' union? And now you're well off and you want to see them starved off a strike. Shame on you. So that's what he says to his father. Okay, and of course, the United Mine Workers, remember, was one of the first unions to go with the CIO, to break away from the AFL and join the CIO. And so he's reminding his father that, hey, even though you were a steel worker, these are your people, WTF, right? And the father kind of sheepishly answers on page 4, you're right about the miners' union, he said, as I followed him into the kitchen. We owe them, you and me. And then Jack tells us he returned to his argument about the role of the welfare cheaters in undermining our society. So there you have a really interesting story about this generational divide. It's also a political division. And it leads Jack, the author, to ask what happened to the working class memory of labor radicalism. And he uses that as a jumping off point for his story of the steel strike of 1959, which is largely forgotten today, but which was, at its time, the largest strike in American history. It was nationwide, and yet it's largely forgotten. Why? So the book tells the story of the 59 strike, but also asks what happened to our memory of working class radicalism. And in order to do that, he needs to talk about class and class interests. And he discusses what he calls the 3-class model of understanding the class dynamics in American society. And the 3-class model includes rich, poor, and middle class. But he says middle class covers up a lot. I mean, middle class, what does that mean? There's a lot of people who would call themselves middle class, but they're not the same economically or in terms of social status. So he says what we need to use instead is what he calls the 4-class model. And you take middle class and you break that up into what he calls the working class and the professional middle class. Now, what is professional middle class? In some ways, this is the divide between what's called white-collar workers, workers who work for a salary, and blue-collar workers, workers who work for an hourly wage. There's also income differences, there's educational differences, and there's difference in the kind of control one has over one's work. Usually in blue-collar work, you're told what to do. In white-collar work, you have some control, some greater control over your own work. A good example of that is me. Right? I'm a member of the professional middle class. I have a fairly high level of education. I get to decide how to design my courses based on my expertise. And so that gives me some control over my work. And so this is a difference between working class, and professional middle class. Though we shouldn't make those distinctions too rigid. Okay, there's always some gray area when we're talking about class in society. But it's important to understand in this book the distinction he makes between the working class and the professional middle class. Because if you think about who our culture shapers are, they tend to be from the professional middle class, right? I mean, whether we're talking about teachers or history professors or people who write the history books, or whether we're talking about television or Hollywood, or whether we're talking about news media personalities, these are people who would be classified as professional middle class. And some of them are relatively high income, okay? And it's also important to remember that news media, Hollywood, and publishing, these are all corporate capitalist enterprises. So the professional middle class also exists within this capitalist system and often writes about it in ways that justify the system, in ways that are not critical. Present company accepted, okay? I mean, my class is one of those classes where you're going to get to question how capitalism works and whether it's fair. And that is part of the privilege of being able to have some control over my own work. So understanding that also is a key to understanding why, for example, most Americans don't know a lot about working class history. They don't know the kinds of things that the Highlander School used to teach to the CIO organizers. And then we have to ask, what's the upshot of that in terms of worker self-confidence and worker self-consciousness? I think it has a big impact. Okay, so take a look at the introduction to Metzgar's Striking Steel. And then in my next video, we're going to talk about chapters 1 and 2, which are the period leading up to the strike of '59. Okay. In the video after that, we will talk about chapters 3 and 4, which dive into the strike itself and the issues that were at stake in that strike. And I think you'll find that even though it's kind of a detailed explanation of the issues, these are issues that are relevant to workers even today. Okay. And then the final section, section 3, which is chapters 5 and 6, those chapters will discuss the question of memory and how it is that we know what we know, why it is that we've forgotten much of our history. Okay, so this is, I think, one of the most engaging books. And though I am disappointed that we won't be in class together to talk about it, I want all of you to read your chapters, do your summaries, but also please comment and discuss on the discussion boards that I will provide for each of the chapters. And I want you to not only comment on your chapter, but I want you to go to the chapters that you didn't read and look at what the comments are on those chapters as well. Okay, and so hopefully we can have a nice wide-ranging discussion about the issues that are raised in this book. All right, I look forward to discussing this with you and having a good time reading this book. Thanks.